People who say, "You know what I mean." There's a phrase that shows up everywhere. In conversations, in meetings, in casual explanations that never quite land. You know what I mean. It usually comes at the end of a sentence, sometimes in the middle, sometimes more than once. On the surface, it sounds friendly, inclusive, almost collaborative. It assumes understanding. It assumes shared context. It assumes you're already there. And most of the time, you nod, not because you fully understand, but because stopping the conversation would feel heavier. The phrase moves things along. It smooths over uncertainty. And suddenly, clarity becomes optional. It usually starts casually. Someone is explaining an idea, a feeling, a situation. They hesitate for a moment, search for the right words, and then, instead of finishing the thought, they lean on the phrase, "You know what I mean." It fills the gap. It replaces detail. It keeps the rhythm going. You're invited to agree, not to understand. So you nod, or say yeah, or smile politely. The conversation continues as if something solid was shared. Nothing feels wrong, nothing feels aggressive, but something small is skipped, and no one goes back to pick it up. Over time, the phrase becomes a habit. It appears again and again in different conversations. Each time it does the same thing. It closes a thought without completing it. It signals agreement without checking for it. "You know what I mean" slowly replaces explanation. And the listener adapts. You stop asking follow-up questions. You stop interrupting. You start filling in the gaps yourself. The conversation feels smooth, but also slightly hollow. Nothing is clarified. Nothing is challenged. Everyone keeps moving forward on assumptions that were never confirmed. On the receiving end, something subtle happens. You feel slightly behind, but not enough to interrupt. You sense that you're expected to understand, even if you don't. So you carry the uncertainty quietly. Later, you might replay the conversation, trying to reconstruct what was meant, what was assumed. And the phrase echoes, not as information, but as pressure, because asking for clarification now feels too late. The moment passed, the nod already happened, and the conversation moved on without ever really meeting in the middle. Most people don't use this phrase intentionally. They use it to protect the flow. Explaining things clearly takes effort, and sometimes courage. "You know what I mean" reduces the risk of being misunderstood by avoiding precision altogether. It assumes shared experience, shared context, shared thinking. And if that assumption is wrong, the responsibility quietly shifts to the listener. If you didn't understand, maybe you should have. The phrase keeps the speaker comfortable. It avoids slowing down. It avoids vulnerability. And socially, it's accepted, because clarity can feel awkward, but agreement feels smooth. At some point, you recognize yourself. You've used the phrase, not to confuse, but to keep going. You didn't want to over-explain. You didn't want to sound unsure. You didn't want to slow the moment down, so you trusted the phrase to do the work. And most of the time, it did. People nodded, they agreed, they moved on. But now, listening back, you wonder how much was actually shared, how many assumptions replaced clarity, how many nods replaced understanding. You didn't mean to skip the meaning. You just assumed it was already there. And maybe that's the habit. Not misunderstanding, but never checking. "You know what I mean" isn't wrong. It's familiar. It's smooth. It keeps conversations comfortable. But it also asks for agreement before understanding. It fills silence without adding clarity. And maybe that's why it survives everywhere, because it lets us feel connected without fully explaining ourselves. So the next time you hear it or say it, You might pause, not to correct it, not to question it, just to notice what it replaces. And if this feels familiar, you might want to stick around. Who approved this?